All right. So yeah, welcome to this session about asset tokenization using Daml Finance. We at Digital Asset, we are a financial technology provider building a layer 1 blockchain solution as well as a smart contract framework called Daml. And what I want to talk about today is Daml Finance, which is our toolkit to do asset tokenization. Just to put this into the context of our overall product, I mentioned Canton is the layer 1 blockchain, specifically set apart with its privacy features that allow application operators to really control the granularity and the level of privacy that they need within their application, and then while still allowing these applications to talk to each other and interoperate. On top of that, the Daml language framework is really our programming toolkit to develop distributed applications on Canton. And then Daml Finance sort of sits at the top here in the application space. So it's a set of libraries and tools to model financial assets and bring them on-chain in a tokenized form. Now this all comes together in what we call the Canton network, which is really the overall ecosystem of all Daml applications that have been built and that we're sort of bootstrapping now to really bring those applications together and find interesting use cases across them. And Daml Finance plays an integral part in that it's not just a toolkit to accelerate these application builds, but also a way of standardizing asset representations across different applications, which is a prerequisite if you want to have seamless interoperability between them. Maybe a quick word around the overall ecosystem that we have in the Canton network. What you can see on this slide is sort of a selection of our customers. You can see there has been a lot of activity in sort of the asset creation issuance bit, so that's really firms wanting to bring assets into the network. We see activity picking up on the sort of cash treasury side. People are much more comfortable these days with tokenized deposits and the likes. But then also in the middle here, we have some examples of utilities that are also required in the network, because what one hurdle that asset tokenization has suffered so far is really that these assets are sort of stranded on a blockchain without much utility to them. So you can pretty much only buy and hold them. Whereas what you want to do is you want to lend them out, you want to use them for financing purposes, and that's where these utilities come in. Now, specifically looking at Daml Finance, what's in the box, we're trying to cover really what are the repeatable building blocks that we see being used in many different use cases. So that starts at the very bottom here with simple asset registry functionality. So that's representing your token, being able to transfer it, concept of accounts, and really the basics. On top of that, we've built a fairly flexible modeling framework that allows us to describe financial instruments in terms of the different cash flows that they entail, and then also allow them to be processed and life-cycled through the toolkit. We have standard sort of settlement implementations allowing you to do atomic DVP, PVP, and more complex settlement arrangements. And then last but not least, at the top here is really, I think, an area where we differentiate quite a bit from other toolkits or solutions that are out there, in that we bring the lifecycle management also on-chain, which means that these assets that you tokenize using Daml Finance, they can be pretty much fully automated in terms of managing, servicing them throughout the lifetime. So the goal is really with the toolkit to cover as much of the value chain as possible, at least the parts that we see sort of being repeatable, across as much of the product landscape that is out there. Now, if we sort of go one level deeper and look at sort of what is the feature map, what are the specific things that we have put in there so far. On the tokenization side, it's really different types of tokens depending on what kind of asset we're talking about. The ability to lock them, so encumber them for a specific purpose. Various forms of account setups with different permissioning models. That's really at the very core. And then I mentioned the modeling toolkit. So here's just a few examples of kind of pre-packaged financial instruments that we have put in there. But ultimately, the toolkit is generic in the sense that you can use it to model any sort of asset. And I can probably show you how that's being done. Yeah, then on the sort of lifecycle side, different types of events that we can handle here, corporate actions, but also optionality, option exercises, the ability to call or put a financial instrument, or to make an election, for example, for convertibility. And the last bit really is around settlement. So there we do support various types. It can be multi-asset, multi-party. We essentially provide a settlement container that can contain any type of asset transfers, which you can then execute atomically. Now, the thing that I want to show here today is centered around the asset modeling bit, and really take you through what it takes to create an asset from scratch, and then have it supported in the platform, and running creating some lifecycle events on the back of that. So I call this a 0 to 1 because we're literally starting with a blank sheet of paper and then creating that new asset. So before I go into actually creating a new asset here, I want to just spend a minute to talk about the particular data model that we use to represent these financial instruments, and I'll explain that by the example of a simple fixed rate bond. So if you look at how this bond is represented, it's really a sort of structural description of the cash flows that are entailed in this financial instrument. So if we zoom out, you see this tree structure here, where one particular subtree here describes a single payment, a single cash flow that comes off that instrument, and then we string together these cash flows to describe the overall bond payout. Now, this seemingly simple sort of description language for financial instruments is actually quite powerful. So we can not only describe bonds, we can describe things like interest rate swaps, which are nothing else than a series of cash flows. In this case, we have the additional complexity of bringing in an external data observation that then drives the size of this cash flow. But other than that, we're basically simply putting a fixed rate leg here on the right-hand side together with a floating rate leg, and that gives us the interest rate swap payoff. There's also concepts for like optionality, and you can see that toolkit is very modular and composable in the sense that you can stitch together your financial instruments. You can take a bond and some kind of option and put them together to create a structured product. So in that sense, it's very flexible and sort of open-ended, if you will, in terms of what you can model with it. Now, the particular example that I want to talk through here is the scenario when somebody calls you up and asks you for a very particular type of payoff that you might not have in your sort of templatized library, and you actually want to create something from scratch. So you can do that by simply essentially building up that tree out of simpler building blocks. In this case, we're saying the customer wants to have, let's say, exposure to Tesla stock, and therefore we're going to put together a product that reflects that exposure. So we'll give it 2 legs, and we'll add a put option on the left-hand side and a call option on the right-hand side. And now we're able to specify the underlyings, the strikes, and with a couple of clicks we are able to put together a customized financial instrument, and thereby then tokenize it and bring it on chain. So just going to fill out the call option here, and now we've essentially created this customized payoff. We'll have to give it a name, and then we can originate that particular instrument, and we now see it's added to the list. And bear in mind that there's no code that's specific to that particular asset. We've essentially created that at runtime, added it to the platform, and we can now do things with it. We can issue units on it, we can lifecycle it, and one particular example that I can show is we have this small little simulation tool that essentially allows us to take any one of these assets and essentially run a couple of lifecycle operations on it to figure out what is the payoff that I can expect in the future. So we're essentially running the lifecycle process at maturity under certain scenarios. So here I'll specify I want to see what happens if Tesla is anywhere between 100 and 400, and essentially then runs multiple lifecycle operations simulating what is the payout if we have a certain price of Tesla stock. And what you get out of that, as you can probably imagine, is this classical sort of payoff diagram that tells you how that particular asset behaves. But all we've done here is really run a handful of simulated lifecycle operations to figure out what are the resulting cash flows. And as I said, this would work with any kind of tree that we come up with. So in that sense, it's very flexible and it's extensible. Now, why that's interesting to our customers is really because it allows them to sort of incrementally innovate on top of the platform. So if you have the basic blocks in place around how to handle issuance, maybe some kind of distribution, then you can literally start building up a product pipeline that allows you to move very quickly in getting these to market, right? And that's primarily where I guess the interest comes from in this toolkit and where we set ourselves apart. So coming back to the deck here, the idea really is that the way that this is supposed to be used operationally in a bank, for example, is really that once you have the asset registry and the lifecycle management in place, you can now essentially start adding products to your library. And similar to what I've shown earlier, you could prototype them either in code or through some kind of UI. That would typically be something that the structuring teams or quant teams would do. And then you can templatize a certain payoff. If you see, this is repeatable business, I want to do more volumes, you can templatize it and thereby make it easier to then create specific instances, specific issuances of that particular product. So you can see that it's a very sort of streamlined pipeline where I'd argue you could probably bring a new product to market in a matter of days rather than weeks or months as it's currently the case. Right. So the last point I want to touch upon is sort of our view on how to approach these tokenization projects. There is different sort of building blocks that you need to consider, everything from investor onboarding to the distribution to lifecycle management, listing, trading. So the question is, where do you start and how do you sequence it? And really, the way to approach these things is you start with the simplest possible thing that already provides value, and that is typically the asset registry. That's the first thing you need if you want to bring something on chain. You need a registry to maintain ownership. So if you think about how that could look like, is that once you have the registry in place, you could already do a digital issuance, right? You cannot do sort of much with the asset on chain, but you can already represent the ownership. So in a sense, just having a registry is sufficient to issue your first product, and it allows you to go through all the legal and compliance motions that are typically required to get this signed off. The next bit is then typically to look into the lifecycle management of these products. That's kind of similar to what I've shown here. And while doing so, you also want to open up sort of distribution pipelines. That means that if the bank has a wealth management arm, you want to plug into that because that gives all the issuers, potential issuers on the platform, really a way into a large investor base where they can actually sell those products. So in that sense, you make it attractive for issuers, also external issuers, to come in and offer their products to the wealth management arm. And really from there, it's just about expanding the products depending on where there's the business need and trying to increase the coverage of the tokenization solution, such that you can bring in really institutional business, OTC business. There's really that's sort of the direction to take. And then I guess the last bit that I'm showing here is really then to start thinking about where does it make sense to make these connections within the wider network. So with the assets that we bring into the network, what can we do with them? Do we want to connect it to a repo solution so you can use it for financing, or to a SEC lending solution? That's then really to increase the utility of those assets that you bring into the network. And of course, digital cash is also something that you can consider then to make essentially the settlement of all these cash flows a lot more efficient than if you go through traditional rails. So yeah, that was a really quick rundown on Daml Finance and how it comes to life in practice. So yeah, thanks for listening in.